Majority of Nigerians will have heaved a sigh of relief with yesterday's pronouncement by the Supreme Court, extending the use of the 200, 500, and 1,000 denominations of the Naira till December 31st, 2023. How much relief can this judgment bring to long-suffering citizens who for months on end have been starved of cash to afford the most fundamental of what they need to run their homes and businesses? But could there be further judicial landmines ahead of Nigeria continues to battle the consequences of a badly implemented fiscal policy? Our rights analyst, Dr. Sam Amadi, joins us now. Good morning, Dr. Amadi. Good to have you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, let's go straight into it. The heart of the judgment by the Supreme Court on the Naira redesign issue and the validity, of the new Naira notes. What do you make out of it? On the one hand is the question of nullification. What would be your understanding of what precisely the Supreme Court nullified? And then final word on when the validity of the old notes will be. One key thing that Nigerians will be interested in is that, yes, Supreme Court has given a judgment. Will those notes, particularly the 500 and the 1,000 Naira denominations, will they still be available? And if they have been destroyed, as there are claims here and there, no concrete word from the Supreme Court, where will that put Nigerians? And what will happen to those who simply think that print more of the new Naira notes so that we can get our life back on track? What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, first, I think it's important to underscore that the takeoff of this discussion is that the Supreme Court's decisions are final. Like Joseph Puta, who quoted American jurist, is final because it's the last resort. It's not final because it is the sumbulum of wisdom. It's not final because it's not infallible. So the Supreme Court's final is not final supreme wisdom. It's final authoritativeness. So having decided that the next is enforcement. But we know from history of Supreme Courts and very critical, important political or policy issues, that enforcement of some of the orders at the Supreme Court may not be very coherent, run smoothly, and as comprehensive as people would think. For example, in the U.S., on the issue of segregation, we knew when the Supreme Court says deliberate, speed, and at the end of the day, it needed paratroopers to enforce the clear order around desegregation. Interestingly, the Supreme Court is the highest authority in the land, constitutionally, but also the weakest in terms, the judiciary is the weakest because it does not really enforce its orders. That is a mutual cooperation between the Supreme Court and the executive, between the judiciary and the executive to get its orders implemented. We know one of the high points of this was the Youngstown case in the U.S. when the president asked, why should the Supreme Court tell us what to do? And it was almost going to be a crisis for the state. So here we are. The Supreme Court says the decision first. The Supreme Court nullified the policy. Some of us have argued, and the Supreme Court didn't agree with us, that first, the issue of jurisdiction, I didn't think this is one of those issues that the framers of our Constitution wanted the Supreme Court taking its original jurisdiction. Because we didn't want the Supreme Court to be all commerce, to be burdened, so that the Supreme Court would take everything on original jurisdiction. That's not the way to go. Secondly, many of us felt that there should be significant deference to the monetary authority of the executive branch, Section 5. The Supreme Court ruling first is that enough time was not given. Now, if there's a statutory mandated time, 90 days, for before such policies come, and the Supreme Court, the SCBN and the federal government fail to, there is a due process failure, which itself nullifies that policy. But the other argument around consultation seemed to me too overstretched. The constitutional design everywhere in the world is that the executive power is strictly defined by the Constitution and any act made by National Assembly, which is what Section 5, 5.2, 5.1a and b and 5.2 provides for the state. So whenever a president has a power that's clearly his, donated to him by the National Assembly or conferred on him by the Constitution, consultation is a matter of administration and political salesmanship. You want a policy to be coherent, implement very well, you consult. There's no obligation, in my view, for widespread consultation of governors, even the president consulting the Council of State, except in the matter of security, where the Police Act and the Constitution provides for, is gratuitous and part of good governance and not necessarily a constraint on the prince's power. One thing that came out clear that the Supreme Court was very angry with the federal government's failure to fully implement its earlier injunctive order, ex parte injunctive order, especially by making that broadcast that basically seemed to impliedly disobey that Supreme Court order. So you can see that anger writ large in the judgment, and maybe oftentimes, like I said, Supreme Court is final, but not final wisdom. And so we are back to a point where we've exhausted the legal avenue, legal challenge, and we're back to politics now, back to administration. So the implementation will now have to follow. The question then is, what should be done? First, from all legal consideration, the old notes, 1,500, are still legal tender. That's really what the Supreme Court is saying until the 31st of this year. I don't know how they came about that date, whether it's magical or textual. But again, two, it's clear that no citizen will be arrested or prosecuted for trying to, it's still a bill of exchange. So you can use it to exchange for things, whether it's taxi, transport, or buying groceries in the market, it's still a legal tender. Number three, this decision does not regulate how the central bank intervenes in money supply through OMO, open market operations, or other forms of monetary policy intervention. So the central bank is not compelled to print X amount of money. The central bank mopped up about 1.something trillion or two and put back into the system 300 billion at the first instance. This decision does not require the central bank to say you must put 1.1 trillion or 2 trillion back into the system so that we have the same level of liquidity that we have cash. No, this policy is about cashlessness. Therefore, there's nothing in this policy, on this decision of the Supreme Court, that mandates the central bank to increase money supply, increase availability of cash in the system. Those are going to be operational issues that the central bank will use. And that's the reason why people thought that there are two aspects of the policy. One is the policy side, which is about power of the federal government over currency matter. There's an issue about implementation, which is a matter of administration that should go to the Federal High Court. If there, for example, a bank can even sue the central bank on this policy and argue that probably it affects its right as a commercial bank to deal with the customer as it likes, a customer can even sue his bankers on this policy, how it is implemented. And it sounds to me like the quarrel of the governors, everything they say, is about implementation. They say, look, we're not challenging the president's power. So as a legal scholar, I'm at some difficulty understanding if you're not challenging the extent of federal power vis-a-vis the state to make a policy, then you are focusing on how it's implemented. That is managerial, that's administrative. And so maybe through the other courts, you can deal with some of those aspects and more particularized. For example, if somebody is challenging the central bank that 300 billion is not proper, it's not adequate to finance an economy like this, it might be something for the bankers committee, it might be something for the Federal High Court, depending on the nature, whether it's judicially cognizable and manageable. So I think the key takeaway here is that we're probably getting to a point where the Supreme Court and the government of Nigeria should have some conceptual clarity as to where interventions should be political and where interventions should be judicial, where interventions should be technocratic and managerial and not judicial. So it looks to me that we're going to test in the days to come whether the decision is prudential, whether the decision is practically manageable in the sense that people expect. So if I go to Wuse Market in Abuja here this morning with my old 500, I expect that the seller there collects that money and gives me value in terms of product. But the seller is still here under the Supreme Court said XYZ, but he is not sure. Like somebody reported this morning that the guy says the print has not said we should use it. So will the president now come out with an address and says, and the central bank governor says, everybody use it. So you now begin to see that although constitutionally the Supreme Court is the highest, but in terms of certain relevance, in terms of contextual authority, these other levels are part of the structure for carrying out those instructions of the Supreme Court in a more practical way. And if anyway they don't line up properly or the instructions are not feasible in the context of where they are, the stories around old notes have been burnt, we need to either print more of those old notes, could unintendedly or intentionally obstruct the implementation of the Supreme Court decision, not in a case that you cite anybody for contempt, but in a case that you get trapped by the routineness of things, by the nature of things themselves. The fact that, and that's why, this is why it suggests the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Chevron and natural resource defense, classical, says, look, the court is not an expert in everything. The court is just an expert in law. Therefore, the court should defer to regulators, defer to them, because they have the expertise. So the court can say this action is unconstitutional, illegal, but allow the regulator to fashion out a solution that can, deal with that illegality, but feasibly create the effect that the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court intends is for people to be relieved, people to go to market. You do not have to use trade by barter, as they argued. They want solution at the level of outcome. But it might look like, going forward, that those the way we left it now in the air depends a lot on what Mr. President and the governor does outside the strict orders of the Supreme Court, but in consonance with those orders. So it's tricky, and it reinforces what I've said. We should learn that some policies, monetary policy, economic policies, have been reserved for the executive branch on Section 5, and we should not usurp the function of the president or these regulatory bodies in the guise of judicializing economic policy.
All right, Dr. Amadi. It's one thing to get secure judgment from the Supreme Court, and as we've seen play out in the course of the last 7 years, it's another thing for those judgments to be implemented. Of course, the Speaker of the House of Reps, talking about Femi Gbajabiamila, yesterday released a statement urging the Central Bank of Nigeria's governor, Godwin Emefiele, to adhere to this particular judgment. Talk to me. We've not heard from the CBN concerning this particular ruling. At the moment in time, what do you think would happen? Because it seems that there is fear on the side of those that went to court that this might just be a ruling on paper. And like you've rightly alluded to, there might not be implementation. It's a different ballgame. Talk to us about this.
Well, if I were the governor of Supreme Court, as governor of Central Bank, I would really maybe wait a minute, study this more carefully. First, the CBN governor was the party, and it was deliberate. The people who constructed this intervention wanted to sidestep the central bank because they don't want to go to Federal High Court. They quickly ramp up to the Supreme Court because they needed speed to make it have impact on the election. That's the whole idea. The whole idea was politics. I mean, like Malam El-Rufai said, oh, we tried everything. No, you didn't try everything. You told Mr. President, he said, give him 7 days. And before 7 days, we went to court because you have a fast track. And we're arguing on a bigger scale here that the central bank should make that original jurisdiction a narrow corridor. It's designed as a narrow corridor, but it looks like we're opening it, in my sense, too wide. Now, if you didn't sue the governor of Central Bank, and others say the federal government and its organs, I'm yet to see a specific order addressed to the governor of Central Bank as part of subsidiary order to say, for example, therefore, the governor of Central Bank the federal government should direct the governor of Central Bank to do X, Y, Z. Those are practical things that has to be done. Learning from the Youngstown case and the case on segregation, what we also learn is that the realism of judicial intervention is not just about just crafting decisions that are politically feasible, but also, in some cases, stepping them down to implementable, bites. So, do this, A should do this, B should do this, C should do this. So, the order is, this is nullified. Let this become legal tender. So, what does the central bank need to do to make something legal tender? Is to say these Naira notes are now have been brought back as legal tender because we had made them illegal tender, exercising our power under the Central Bank Act. Now they are legal tender. So the next question is, like co-anchor asks, how many of us still have those notes? Of course, most reasonable Nigerians made the effort before it became politicized to put in back their Naira currency. Some people have argued it was a confiscation. There's no confiscation of property here. The central bank says, bring back your money and we redeem the value for you and put it in safe custody in the bank, which is what it's supposed to be. But you are not going to be taking them out in these sizes, which originally, there's no system in the world, financial system in the world where there's no control on how much you can take out in cash. There's always a control, prudential control, a momentary control. The banks can say, look, we don't have enough cash, we can do this, and that those happens. For example, they may give you 50 naira, and you have to use a truck to carry 2 billion. You can't insist that they must give you 1,000. So there's some level of control on cash. But what is guaranteed is that the value you have is the value there. Now,
all right, Dr. Sam.
Those who couldn't put in their money are those who are concerned. So what I would say practically to the concern is that the central bank should show good faith to the decision. But again, there are certain operational actions that he may not undertake. For example, print new currency to match up the old ones they have bought, if the case. There's some things that will take time. And the question then is, how reasonable should we now expect people to accept this legal tender from customers in other transactions when they know that maybe they won't be able to make much use of it? So it's pragmatics. We're going to wait and see what happens in the days to come. But my final word is, look, let's be careful.
All right, Dr. Sam.
Monetary policy and politicized judicial policy.
I want to say thank you very much for your time.